In this video, I'm going to talk about an often overlooked category of pens that I feel are the best option for artists in search of that perfect pen to draw with. That category is German flex pens made in the 1950s and 1960s that feature semi-flexible nibs. My search for the perfect flex pen probably began the same way it did for most people, with the humble Noodler's Ahab. And while I still like this pen and use it often, it turned out to be a gateway drug. I started lurking in the fountain pen forums and learned that some of the very best flex pens were made in the golden era of fountain pen production between 1910 and 1930, and that companies like Waterman, Conklin, and Wahl Eversharp produced wonderfully springy and flexy nibs that are unrivaled by anything today. Curious to know what it was like to draw with one of these wonders, capable of producing giant line variation, and completely seduced by all those photos of sinuous, juicy figure eights, I started searching for a vintage flex pen of my very own. It's been a few years, and now I own a modest collection of vintage pens from that golden era. And true enough, the nibs on these pens are absolutely wonderful, being incredibly responsive and capable of putting down wispy lines as well as thick, expressive strokes. In addition, the feeds here are perfectly tuned for flex, so even if you're putting down fast flex lines, the pen won't railroad, and yet those thick lines won't be super wet as they would be in some modern flex pens. Unfortunately, there are also some significant downsides to using pens from that golden era, which make them completely unsuitable for drawing outside of the studio. The first issue is that they're drippy. A flex pen has to have a very generous feed in order to keep the pen from running dry when flexed. The problem is, shake any one of these pens and you'll get an unwelcome splatter on your paper. Be careless enough to store them nib side down and you'll get a cap filled with ink. Golden era pens are much better left at home, carefully stored nib side up, which negates their usefulness tremendously. The whole point of using fountain pens, to my mind, is their portability. I enjoy using these in the comfort and safety of my studio, but frankly, there they provide no advantage over my trusty old dip pen, which is dirt cheap, can be used with a much larger variety of ink, and can be cleaned instantly. Then there's another problem. Most of the pens from that era are sac fillers, meaning that they are filled by depressing a rubber sac inside the pen, which in turn gets filled with ink. These types of filling systems have very poor ink capacity and makes it impossible to tell how much ink is in your pen. Again, if you're using the pen at home, that's not a big issue, but if you're looking for a pen for outdoor sketching, it's pretty annoying. These two issues are what make artists turn to modern flex pens. The Pilot 912 FA or the Pilot 743 FA, for example, are super reliable, don't leak, and have very decent ink capacity. These are great, rather expensive options, but what do you do if you're that persnickety person who insists on using vintage flex nibs, which, let's all admit, are just better? This is where mid-century German fountain pens come in. They are very durable, they don't leak all over the place, and most of them are piston fillers with good ink capacity. And while most fountain pen makers in the United States stopped manufacturing flex pens by the 1950s, the practice continued in Germany well into the 1970s. So many of these pens feature wonderful semi-flex nibs. These pens are perfect for the artists who want a relatively affordable, reliable flex pen for sketching on the go. Furthermore, most of these pens are manufactured in great quantities and have not yet become a target for collectors, so you won't have a hard time obtaining them. Let's talk about these two pens first, the Pelikan 140 and the Pelikan 400 NN. The 140 is a small pen made for the student market from 1952 to 1964 and came in a variety of colors and nib options. This is a late production model from the 1960s with green and black stripes and is the most common and easiest to find. It features a piston filling mechanism and a translucent body which allows you to see how much ink is in the pen. It's on the smaller side and almost like a pocket pen, but still very well balanced when capped. The nibs on these will vary a lot, from very stiff to almost short of full flex, so make sure you see a writing sample before buying them. This one, though it was sold as fine, puts down a juicy line that is closer to medium and is a delight to draw with. I like all sorts of nibs, even ones that have a lot of feedback, but with this one, you don't feel like you're making contact with the paper. It glides effortlessly and makes you feel loose and expressive. I love it for quick sketches and always have it filled with some kind of green ink, because I'm one of those silly people who likes to match their inks to the pen. One of my first German semi-flex pens and still one of my favorites. I bought this one from an online seller, Rick Propas, from his website The Penguin, which I highly recommend. He specializes in Pelikans and always has the 140 in stock. Just make sure to ask for a semi-flex model. I've also seen nibs that approximate full flex, but I think these are fairly rare and I suspect they've been modified to be that flexible. One important piece of advice for those interested in buying a vintage pen is to focus on one brand and to be very patient. Research the brand, decide what model to hunt for, and take the time to learn the terrain. Commit to not buying anything until you've understood the price range of the particular model you're looking for. This will prevent you from overbidding and allow you to pounce when you see a good deal. That's what happened here. This is a 400NN that I snapped up for a very good price on eBay. The 400s were Pelikan's best-selling mid-range pens, and tons of them were produced from 1950 to 1964, mostly in the standard green striped version. This one, however, is the rare tortoise shell model from the 1960s, which often sells for much, much more. While I rarely purchase a pen for its appearance, in this case it costs less than most green striped versions, and I slam the buy button. This pen is slightly longer than the 140, but is still on the smaller side. Like the 140, it also features a piston filling mechanism and a translucent body. If appearance matters to you, this is a fancier pen than the student grade 140, manufactured to higher standards, and the gold plating is usually better preserved. Once again, the range of nib options is huge, so look for writing samples before buying. This pen surprised me because even though the nib on both the 140 and the 400NN are marked as fine, the 400NN puts down a far thinner line and doesn't have as much flex to it. This one is capable of putting down very thin lines and is great for very small detailed work. And how lovely is this tortoise shell finish. Here are two less well-known German semi-flex pens, the Montblanc Monte Rosa 042G, made between 1950 and 1959, and the Montblanc 342G, which I couldn't find exact dates on, but also from the 50s or early 60s. Don't let the Montblanc name turn you off. Before they changed business plans and began making overpriced status symbols in the late 1970s, Montblanc used to make a wide variety of well-made pens, some in the student grade range. This Monte Rosa is an unassuming looking pen, but despite its humble appearance, its build quality is superb. These pens have very smooth piston filling mechanisms, one of the first to use a silicone piston, and they often feature wonderful gold semi-flex nibs. It's actually very, very similar to the slightly more expensive Montblanc 342G, another pen made for the student market that I also highly recommend, being almost exactly the same size and supposedly made with the same components. Really, the difference between these two is minimal. The Monte Rosa doesn't have the famous Montblanc star and has a slightly different clip design. The nibs are identical, however, so if the price is right, I would go with the less expensive Monte Rosa. Both these pens came in steel and gold nibs, identified with a G after the number, as in 042G and 342G. From what I understand, the steel nibs are also excellent, so if you come across a pen with a steel nib, I would not hesitate getting it. For full disclosure, I bought this Monte Rosa before I realized that not all of them feature a semi-flex nib. Despite this pen not being flexible, I fell in love with it instantly. For one thing, it's super reliable. I've kept it inked without using it for months, and it starts right up. It has a smooth piston filling mechanism, and despite not being flexible, it still allows for some line variation. Since you can easily get the Monte Rosa with a semi-flex nib, I decided to include it in my recommendations. And further full disclosure, I actually just ordered another one with a semi-flex nib. This one I plan to sell to some lucky person looking for a workhorse pen with a springy but not exactly flexy nib. Here are two more lesser-known pens that deserve way more recognition, the Osmia 883 and 884, made in the 1950s. Osmia fountain pens have a complicated history. Founded in 1919 by ex-employees of Kaweco, it quickly became the second largest pen manufacturer in Germany before running into financial troubles in the late 20s and being acquired by Parker. In 1935, it was bought by Faber-Castell, who continued making pens under the prestigious Osmia brand, until the 1960s when the name was eventually phased out. I say this not to bore you with fountain pen history, but only because these pens are sometimes confusingly sold as Osmia, or Faber-Castell Osmia, or just Faber-Castell. These two pens, despite being advertised on eBay as Osmia, have no Osmia markings on them, other than the original logos on the nib and the finial. The 880 series were mid-range models which consisted of the 882, the 883, and the 884, and came either in this green stripe model or the black, both having clips that look a lot like the ones made by Pelican. 883 is a lovely looking thing in striped dark green celluloid, which allow you to see the ink inside the chamber, and it features a remarkably smooth 14K semi-flex nib. The 884 is not as interesting, made of black resin, but with a pretty striped dark yellow ink window and a slightly larger, equally exquisite nib. Both are piston fillers with terrific ink capacity. I really like these pens with their really nice build quality and lovely details, such as the two-tone nib with the Osmia Faber-Castell logo, as well as the little logo on the finial. My small collection only represents 3 of the more popular brands, and there are many more that deserve attention. The pen manufacturer Sonicon had the reputation of producing very fine pens, and I plan to do more research on it and acquiring some of their models. There's also the brand Geha that produced pens into the 1970s before being bought by Pelikan. Kaweco also made some very fine piston filling pens for the student market in the 50s and 60s. Unfortunately, most of these, with few exceptions like these Pelicans, are very plain and functional looking, adhering very closely to the design of the Monte Rosa, black, rounded, with a little ink window. For the most part, I don't collect pens for their appearance, but the fact that most of these pens, regardless of brand, all look the same is probably a good thing, preventing me from getting too many of them. Now, before you click over to eBay and start hunting for any of these pens, let's talk downsides. The first, as you may have noticed, is that all of these pens are semi-flex. For whatever reason, German pen manufacturers did not produce full flex nibs, at least after 1950. But if you're an artist who does pen and ink drawings, ask yourself, how much flex do you really need? I think most of us, if we're honest, will answer not that much. You want to be able to work very light to sketch things in, to put in faint and minute details, and to create subtle transitions in value. And you want to occasionally put down a thick line here and there to emphasize distance or show distinctions in texture. But do you really need a pen that goes from extra fine to triple or quadruple broad? Probably not. I really enjoy those super flexible pens, but I have to admit I rarely use their full range of flexibility when drawing. Line variation is a good thing. It can be used to suggest when forms are in shadow, when one thing is closer than another thing, to show distinctions between different textures, but there is too much of a good thing. There's a point where the lines become too calligraphic and decorative, taking over the drawing and becoming a distraction. But here are a few downsides that are more serious. These pens, while generally cheaper than their golden era counterparts, are still fairly expensive. You can find the Pelikan 140 and the Monte Rosa at around $120 US. The Osmi pens will run you about $150, and the Montblanc 342G and the Pelikan 400NN, even the more common green stripe version, at somewhere around $200. And the problem for American buyers is that most of them are still in Europe, which means putting down an additional $15 for shipping. Still, considering that the cheapest modern gold semi-flex pen is the rather unremarkable Pilot Falcon, which costs $180, these pens, which have far better ink capacity and, let's face it, better performing nibs, are the best option. There's another downside to consider, and this one should be considered carefully. For all the advantages piston fillers have over the sac fillers, the sac filling mechanism is far simpler and easier to repair. Replacing a sac is an easy process, and there are plenty of people who do it themselves. Vintage piston fillers are another matter. Case in point is this pen that I just showed you, the Osmia 833. The eBay seller, who I believe made an honest mistake when testing the pen and shall remain nameless, sold it to me with a worn-out piston seal. The piston moves up and down, but no ink is drawn in. While this is a simple fix requiring a part replacement, I'm probably going to have trouble finding a person in the United States who has the parts and knows their way around this pen. I'm going to send it back to the seller in Europe, who should have an easier time getting this pen working again. Incidentally, I found that many sellers of German pens on eBay are from Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Serbia. Since all these pens were made after World War II, the question of how so many of these pens, which were manufactured by West German firms, ended up in Eastern Bloc countries would be interesting to research. Many of these countries had more liberal trade policies than the Soviet Union proper, so perhaps there was more access to the Western market. Or, even more probable, there was a very active black market in these pens. I hope you enjoyed this little view into what I think is an overlooked category of pens, at least in the United States. Again, if you're an artist looking for something sturdy and practical, but want a vintage flex nib, these pens should be something you're aware of. They're readily available for not too much money, perform fantastically well, and most importantly, don't need to be babied. Thanks for watching, and of course, if you have questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to respond.